Good afternoon, everyone. And don't worry, my ego didn't take a hit when I saw a lot of people leave once I was introduced. But anyway, thank you for the introduction, Balaji. And I help companies these days who are acquiring AI, and they're doing it in a number of different ways. They're either buying companies that are developing AI, or they're buying AI technology or licensing AI technology from third parties, or they're developing that in-house. And these days, companies are increasingly looking at leveraging the power of generative AI for coding and software development. So just by way of show of hands, how many people are actually using generative AI for coding or software development? Okay, that's fantastic. And so what I'd like to do is briefly set the stage on touching on the AI coding tools that are available and why it's a good strategy for a company not to say a hard no on generative AI coding tools. Sorry, I'm just trying to advance the slides. Don't know if it's advancing. Perfect. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start off by just surveying the landscape briefly, and then I'm going to touch on a number of risks arising from AI coding tools. So that's going to be a mix of legal and technical risks. And then talk about how you can manage that risk so that companies can feel more comfortable about allowing these tools to be used within their organizations. So AI is not new to software development. For a number of years, there have been tools that either did autocomplete or checks or provided different types of templating. But as we've seen the explosion of large language models, we've also seen large language models being trained on millions of lines of code. And so, OpenAI Codex, which can generate code from natural language descriptions. So in addition to enabling natural language programming, these AI code assistants can do a number of operations like on a code-to-code basis, like code completion, translation, detection of errors and repairing, and summarization, as well as language-to-code operations such as code explanation, so feeding in code into the application and generating documentation and searching for errors. And really by generating code from simple sentences instead of formal syntax-based queries, these AI coding assistants can lower the barrier into programming. And there really are a number of tools available, and the decision as to which one your company chooses will be influenced by a number of decisions. I mean, obviously, there are a number of technical considerations and business considerations like cost, for example. Functionality, like is it truly a generative AI coding tool? Is it going to generate code, or is it merely relying on templates, or is it a code completion tool? How it's trained is also important. Some tools leverage large learning models like Copilot, Tab9, whereas others may rely on natural learning models or ML learning models instead of large language models. And so that will influence the power to actually generate code. You also want to understand the features it offers, languages being an obvious one, understanding whether it integrates into specific IDEs, and then some applications are marketed for specific features like website development or API development. And then some of the other features that I'm hoping that we'll get to talk about today will influence the decision as to how based on whether you choose one to manage some of the risks that we'll talk about. So for example, if you're concerned about potentially losing control of a company's secrets, would that be mitigated to some extent if you were to use a solution that could be hosted on-prem? So, it's a bit of a facetious question, but not quite, as to, really who is the, it's the question that I pose in the abstract, who is the better co-pilot? And I have to say, like, from a branding perspective, I thought the idea of Microsoft branding or marketing their generative AI tool as Copilot is pretty apt. When we think of a co-pilot in aviation, we think of someone who has a skill of flying, who the pilot or the legal commander of the vessel can rely on. And in some cases, I mean, as a co-pilot, you'd expect the co-pilot to take over if the pilot was incapacitated for some reason. And so when I thought about how to make this topic catchy, because I see a lot of these risk-based talks, and so I asked ChatGPT, okay, give me a name of some famous co-pilots so I can add some levity to this presentation. And ChatGPT suggested Chewbacca, who I know is a co-pilot, and Goose. And as I was doing a little more research, I realized, well, Goose is not really a co-pilot. He's actually a radar intercept officer. And so it's kind of interesting because I kind of, sort of highlighted for me two issues. Like one, generative AI models don't always get things right. Like I asked for a co-pilot, it provided me with a radar intercept officer, and I guess I don't know my body of Top Gun that well that I caught that issue. And the second is, our understanding of these generative AI tools is based on how they're marketed. So, if someone says, an application is a co-pilot, we'll want to understand if we can truly rely on it. And so that's another thing that was highlighted by this exercise. And so now when we actually think about what GAI coding tools do, they have the ability to provide services or responses in different languages. So that's something that you'll want to understand. But from a number of academic surveys and analysis of these tools, it's evident that they still struggle with complex tasks. They're good with repetitive tasks, but with complex tasks, they do require a fair amount of prompting. They may require that you provide them with some context. Like, for example, I've seen when I ask, I prompt for a piece of code that will help me pre-process data, I definitely get better results if I open a window and I provide a sample of the data that I want to pre-process. And obviously, if that's something that you're doing, you want to make sure that there's no sensitive data that you're providing as context. And the last one is reliability. So again, with its inability to appreciate context, it may mean that it's less reliable. And so it's really important to understand, like, the software developer is really in control. There will be requirements. You can't utilize these tools without having any understanding of how software development works. It's not a dictionary. You have to understand the process of software development, how the code that you're generating fits into the larger picture. And so that will also influence your use of coding tools and how they're generated, the text that they generate. So I'm going to talk about risks arising from coding tools. And so typically, most clients will come to me because they want to understand legal risks. And if you're a developer who's been wanting to use these tools, it's possible that you may have faced some resistance from either your legal teams or your business teams, and they've said, well, we're concerned about the IP. And the reason why they're concerned about IP is really can be placed in three buckets. So the first one is IP infringement. And when I talk about IP infringement, what I really mean is when you use data or material that someone else owns without consent, and if you don't have their consent, then they may have the ability to sue you for a number of different reasons. So large language models, like most AI solutions, require a large amount of data, and they require a large amount of the correct type of data. And so one of the cases that you may have seen is the fact that two developers that had code hosted on the GitHub repository have sued Microsoft and OpenAI for utilizing that code to develop both the OpenAI Codex and ChatGPT Copilot. And so the interesting thing here is, some people say, well, it's public code. They made it available. How is it being infringed? Well, all that code, when people put their code in public repositories, they're licensing it. And if you're familiar with open source licenses, you'll be aware that they could either select to actually provide it to the public, in which case, yes, you can do anything you like. But there's 12 other licenses they can choose from, some being permissive. So if you use the code, you have to attribute it, you have to comply with copyright notices, or it could be restrictive, like GPL, where if you use you're a software developer, your organization may be leery of allowing you to use GPL license code in specific applications. So in any case, Microsoft's position is that if you place your code on the repository, the terms of use say this: you grant Microsoft GitHub the right to store, parse, display the content, and make copies of the content as necessary to provide the service, which is storing your data, and improving the service over time. And I will say, as a lawyer, those 4 words or 5 words are something that I resist when I am working for a customer who's negotiating against a vendor, because you never want to give some third party the ability to leverage your code to improve a product, especially when that product is machine learning. On the flip side, when you're acting for a vendor, you really want to see that. And the fact that people have provided content to GitHub under those terms, improving the service, gives Microsoft legs to stand on to say, well, we used your code to provide a service, Copilot, and that's really improving the GitHub service. And so, that's Microsoft's position. Of course, the plaintiffs, like the software developers, say, well, you're using code that's licensed, and whether it's permissive license, you're not complying with attribution, copyright notices, and license terms. Now, there are defenses to that, with AI, and if anyone, apart from just this topic, if you are using data to build your AI models, it's possible you can argue that you have rights to do so, or there's an exception to copyright, which is fair use, meaning that your use is transformative. You're using a small amount of the work. You're not really competing with the software, the person who provided that code. And so you will see all these arguments trickle through. But what it means is that if you are using a coding tool, what's your risk as a company? Now, it's unlikely if you're a small developer using ChatGPT and then Copilot, and Copilot is found to be infringing, that the plaintiff's going to come after you. If you're a larger organization, that may be something you want to think about. As well, if you're relying on a particular tool that potentially may be subject to copyright infringement claims down the road, is it possible that the court will ask the vendor to delete that code? I mean, we've seen these cases where people have been found to infringe third-party material, and the underlying models have been the subject of a deletion order where you basically delete it. So something to keep in mind. However, something to keep comfort is that Microsoft is backstopping this in some ways. So, if you are using Copilot, provided you have the public filter feature turned on, they will protect you to some extent if some third party claims that you're infringing their code. But all to keep in mind that there are infringement risks when you use these tools, and they use material that's provided without consent, and that material shows up in your code. The other reason why companies are somewhat leery about using these tools is IP ownership. Now, when you generate code, your company has spent a lot of time and resources developing that code, and they want to own it. Now, one earmark or hallmark of ownership is being able to go to the Copyright Office and register your material as copyright. And if you have copyrightable code, that means that you have more weapons in your arsenal if someone steals your code or a competitor misuses your code, because basically you can sue them under copyright. Now, the issue is that the Copyright Office will not recognize material that's not created by human beings. The whole reason that we have things like regimes like copyright and patents is to incentivize humans to create, so they kind of give you protections. If you If you create material under copyrighted material or patentable material, you have certain rights. Like you are the only person who's allowed to copy or sell or otherwise get money for using those materials. But when you use AI to generate code, the Copyright Office says, well, you haven't really exercised human creativity. It's a machine that's created this code, so I'm not going to copyright it. And so when companies are generating, creating proprietary material, so if you're a SaaS company and this is your proprietary stack and your software developer has generated a whole module using a generative AI tool, the concern is that they can't copyright that code, and in which case they have less ability to fend off someone who's using that code without consent. Now, the other part of it is, the Copyright Office has said, if you generate code or material using a software application or a machine, and you also use human ingenuity, you can file for copyright protection, but you have to disclose that you've used a computer or AI algorithm to generate the material, and you also have to disclaim it. So say, these 4 lines were generated by Copilot, so I'm not going to seek copyright protection. And the interesting thing is that determining what is actually generated by a human or which parts of the code will be considered, the creativity of a human is going to be an interesting exercise. And there is no law or policy that can kind of establish when you can claim copyright. So by way of example, I put 2 images here. And this was a person who created an image, he entered it into a state fair, and he won an award for a machine-generated image. And he went to the Copyright Office and said, hey, I want to register this for copyright. And they said, no, you're not the author because you used the machine. And he refused to disclaim any parts of it. So he was saying that on the basis that he had inputted 624 prompts, which is a significant amount, and he generated the image on the left, and then he took that image on the left and took it into Adobe Photoshop and enhanced it. He removed fragments and artifacts, and he really put a lot more detail, as you can see in the image on the right. And so his basis was like, whoa, the entire thing was generated by a human. And the Copyright Office said, no, that's not enough. Now, the interesting thing is they didn't really ask him to provide his prompts to them to see whether they were in fact creative. Because sometimes if you've played around with an AI solution, like the first time you ask for something, you may get garbage. It's only after your 5th or 6th iteration that you actually get something useful. And by that time, you've kind of broken down the problem into kind of very useful set of subsets. But, and so, one of the things that concerns me is that, that breakdown of a task is, highly valuable in some cases. So if you're going to seek copyright for machine-generated code, it may be that you may have to provide, the Copyright Office with what your company may deem trade secrets. So there's going to be, it's not an easy balance as to whether, you use generative AI tools for code that's super material that your company will want to claim copyright ownership of. And so the other thing that I wanted to note about is, companies are always very concerned, like when you're using AI tools and whatever you input or prompt, whether that's going to be used to train the tool or whether it's going to be ingested by the tool and then some third party gets, your valuable secrets as their outputs. So most of these tools, like the commercial tools that I've reviewed, generally state that your prompts are encrypted or they're otherwise not. They're encrypted, so there's protection between the transfer from your station to their server. They're saying that you own it. They're not going to use it for anything except providing you the output. They don't store it. And so if you are using something that's not a commercial version or you should have someone in legal review to make sure that you do have those rights to own all prompts and that the prompts are not being used. In any case, so now that we've identified these risks, I just want to talk quickly how you can manage them. So for IP infringement, you want to make sure that you're not using third-party code. So make sure that filters that are available on these coding programs, coding generative tools, filter out responses with public code. Microsoft Copilot has one that you can turn on. And if you don't have that turned on, like I said, they're not going to backstop you if your code is in turn found to infringe a third party's code. With Code Whisperer will actually flag third-party code and cite the licenses, which I think is quite useful, because you can actually utilize open source material, and then you can make the decision as to whether you want to ingest it. Whereas with Copilot, because it's filtering out all public code, it's actually filtering out permissive license code that you may find useful, and you would probably use if you knew that you could comply with the notice and attribution stuff. Generating at the snippet level. So, if you are found to have ingested material, I think it's easier to make a case for fair use when you're just using a little, small amounts of code. I also don't know when you're dealing with snippets whether, it's easy to make a case that it's copyrightable and creative if it's just like one line or a part of a line of code. But in any case, I'm not a litigator, so, these are just guidance that clients have used to minimize the risk of IP infringement. And then, make sure that to the extent that you can work with a vendor who's going to either warranty that they're not using, did not train their system using third-party code that was unlicensed. That's also great. And then the last thing, code auditing tools. Like, I'm a big fan of, companies utilizing scans like Black Duck to make sure that they can identify third-party unlicensed code. In terms of IP ownership, if your company is concerned that material IP could be rejected at the Copyright Office because there was use of a generative AI tool, I would say definitely don't utilize it, depending on the concern. If you are going to use it, and some of our clients are fairly bullish, and they'll say, well, we're generating at the snippet level and we're exercising ingenuity, we'll make that argument. But again, that's a fairly risky option because we don't know what the Copyright Office is going to say. If you are going to take that stance, you want to document what prompts you used, what context you provided, so you can make the argument that you were exercised creativity. And if you are going to just take the position, well, I'm only going to seek protection for the stuff that I generated, like using human ingenuity, then identify and comment on the code so that before you commit it, so that you know which parts were generated by AI, so you can disclaim it when you go to the Copyright Office. In terms of IP protection, so like I said, like most of the tools say that they won't use the inputs or the code that's generated, like they kind of forget about it. But again, review the terms and conditions. Definitely opt out of training AI tools with prompts. Like some tools, it's an opt-out feature. So the preset is that you will allow them to use your material. So you want to make sure you can opt out of it. And then the other thing is self-hosted versus public versions. So a lot of clients are very interested in using tab 9 because that's something that you integrate with your IDE and you can host it inside, so you have more control over your sensitive and confidential information. Technical risks, cybersecurity is always an issue. I'm not going to go into this in detail given the time, but there's training data poisoning. So to the extent that the LLM itself is corrupted and spits out malicious code or vulnerabilities, you can't abdicate coding responsibility to the generative AI tool. And there have been studies shown that developers sometimes tend to overestimate the capabilities of this generative AI tool. So there's some type of automation bias where they'll completely accept code without running through their checks that they ordinarily would do. the code on the left I thought was a really interesting example, and I put the name of the paper where they assess the quality of GitHub Copilot's code generation. And you'll see that there's quite a lot of feeding or commenting that's required to get tasks that are complex generated. So that's also something in mind. If you're a novice software developer, you shouldn't over-rely on this code. I think it's great for just doing rudimentary tasks and automating stuff that is repetitive, but for something that's complex, you have to understand how it really translates. So again, in terms of managing cybersecurity risks, human review, avoid over-reliance on the tool, embed security testing tools, run static application security testing. Errors and inaccuracy, you've got to have human review. And I really like having a real-time linting so I can see the red lines and as I'm coding, correct for issues. Test and validate before deployment. I think it goes without saying. And I had to use the word noob to make my son happy, but think of an AI coding tool as a noob. I didn't want to say a novice software developer because sometimes, this is a machine. You may not understand the context. So where you can provide context safely by a context window, using naming conventions that are easily trackable and traceable, and structured code architecture, that really helps you get better results as well. And commenting, I know it sucks and I was terrible at it, but proper commenting, there's really no substitute for that. And so what we've been doing with clients is really trying to help them understand where they fit in the risk strategy. If you're building a SaaS platform, and if that's the way you're generating revenue in your business, they've been a little more concerned about how they roll out generative AI coding tools. But it hasn't been a hard no, because I think it's clear that there's a lot of efficiencies and savings to be garnered by using these tools, but they're being very careful about how they roll it out. So, one thing that we've been doing is working with companies to build an AI usage policy. And, again, if you're familiar with open source, the open source world, it's not very different from how companies were approaching open source. You had had training, and then you had a policy where, permissive licenses, go ahead. You were blessed for that. If you were doing something more restrictive, like GPL, some companies said a hard no, which, again, I don't know if that's the best tack to take, whereas others were more thoughtful about it. They would review where you were using GPL code, whether you truly were going to run the risk of tainting the entire code base by your use of GPL. And it's a similar thing here. So, again, organizations are prohibiting certain uses for generating proprietary code. On the other hand, if they've got legacy products and they're close to end of life, they may not care as much about you maintaining the code base using generative AI tools. And then companies who are developing software for internal use only may permit broader use of generative AI tools. Even if the code is proprietary, they may not care as much that they don't get copyright protection because there's little risk of a third party ever touching that code. And so, again, the breakdown here is, pre-approved, approved uses, prohibited uses. One thing that we've been telling companies to do is try to have this process managed by a bunch of different stakeholders. So, whether it's a combination of legal and business and IT, because I think whatever solution you come up with will have to take into consideration both legal risk and operational risk as well. And then, we've been generating a bunch of sample best practices. And these sample best practices are just some takeaways for you to think. They may not necessarily be useful for your organization, and it definitely is not an exhaustive list. Don't generate incorporate generated code into the proprietary stack, especially if you're considered about IP infringement or IP ownership of the code. Turn on filters, it's almost a no-brainer, but some companies are actually having little checks in the background to make sure developers are doing that, or pre-configuring it so that it's an opt-in. generate code at the snippet level where possible and avoid generating entire programs or packets of code. Again, a bit of a no-brainer. Mark where generated code is committed to any applicable code set. And then don't input proprietary code into a tool, or whether it's for debugging or for generating code, user documentation. And that wraps it up. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
It's on? Okay. You made mention of the use of Black Duck and used it many times. It actually was one of the ones that finds a lot of the snippets even. Has Black Duck or any other two gone to actually pull the audit to find what code they think was generated by Gen AI?
Yes, but I don't think right now it's a publicly available tool, but they did have that offering for a select number of customers as a bit of a beta offer, but they pulled it out. But apparently you can tell when code is generated by, there are like indicia that let you know when it is generated by.
Okay, so it's auditable then?
Yeah.
Okay.
One more question.
Thank you. So if the generative tool spits out some lines of code which I detect, for example, with Black Duck, is part of some third-party code with a permissible license, isn't it a suitable countermeasure to simply acknowledge that it came from there and include the reference to the source?
Well, it depends. So if it's permissive license, definitely, like that will alleviate the concern. However, if it's like GPL license, AGPL license, and your company doesn't want you to utilize that, then that is definitely an issue, yeah.